Thank you, Sophie, and it's great to see you all here to talk about fashion publishing today, and it's great to have Mitchell. As you heard in his introduction, he's very, very well qualified to discuss this topic. So I think just to get started, to talk about this idea of fashion publishing in general across journalism and books and academia, I think, we often hear this phrase that print media is dead. It's something that gets bandied around a lot, but I feel that I've really observed across academic publishing and in just the general bookstores, a rise in books about fashion, whether that's a beautiful coffee table book or an academic exploration of the history of fashion. So why do you think fashion is such a hot topic in publishing right now?
That's a very big question. I'm certainly glad that it is a big topic, otherwise I'd be out of a job. But I think that, with the incredible rise of the internet, that has given us so many opportunities to view fashion in such a fast way, in that incredible 24-hour news cycle. I think there's been sort of a reaction to that in a way where we want to see fashion and appreciate fashion in a more considered manner. And I think publishing, particularly print publishing, allows us to do that. We can take time to read it and view it and appreciate it in a way that we wouldn't do in an online slideshow. And certainly for fashion, which is so caught up in that sense of speed, I think it lends it a sense of gravity and of it sort of makes us aware that it is very artistically important and something that should be appreciated on another level.
And do you think that that's a big part of the reason why fashion publishing has grown, because really it is relatively recent that fashion has perhaps been taken quite that seriously in a cultural context?
Well, it's kind of we were talking about this before, and fashion books have become the new cookbooks. It's what people want to collect on their coffee tables. And I think what's interesting about fashion is that it's not only something that looks great and you can put it out and look at the pictures, but you can also dig into the layers that are behind it and start viewing fashion in a way as sort of a cultural and social barometer. And so it has it sort of plays these great two parts, and you can appreciate it on either of those levels, simply as something to look at, just the eye candy of fashion, or as something that is this great generator of ideas.
And what kind of perspective have you taken in your work? I mean, with a book like Art Fashion in the 21st Century, I suppose you could, it sounds like you're talking about the approach that you've taken with that, where it is kind of straddling something that it's very beautiful, it's very richly illustrated, but it's more than that.
Well, I think that's what people appreciate, and it certainly seems to be what's happening with publishing in books about fashion, is that you can appreciate it on two levels, and that is aesthetically, but also intellectually. And I think that's why it has become as popular as it has. And there's no end to the number of fashion books that are being produced lately, which of course goes against everything that the internet stands for.
And how did you go about, so the remit of art fashion in the 21st century is sort of everything post about 2000, and the confluence, the increasing confluence of things like collaboration between artists and fashion designers, things like museum fashion exhibitions. How did you actually identify the topic for the book, and how did you go about creating the book itself?
Well, Alison Kubler, my co-author, and I, we started talking about this book years before we even wrote it. Alison comes from a curatorial background and is an art historian, and I am a fashion journalist, but we shared this interest in the way that art and fashion seemed to be looking at each other. And of course, it's not a new occurrence. I think fashion has always looked to art movements and particular artists for inspiration in the same way that art has been inspired by fashion's continued relevance and the speed of fashion. But in the past decade, they've really come together in a way that's unprecedented, and now we see fashion in the exhibition space. So, I think it would be hard to imagine seeing a blockbuster fashion show in a museum institution like this 10 years ago, and in Australia now there will be 5 major fashion exhibitions in Australia alone this summer, which speaks of the way that audiences are really engaging with fashion on a way that they never had. So there's that, of course, and then fashion houses have been collaborating with artists over the past 10 years in a way that has been driven by commercial imperative, but it says something about what art offers fashion and what fashion can offer art. So it was important to document all of this. You know, there'd been lots written about the topic, but no sort of singular examination or even a celebration of why these two worlds are looking at each other and what they're getting from each other. And that's what we tried to do with the book. And I think, you know, people always sort of ask the question about whether fashion is art. And I don't think that's something that necessarily needs to be answered. It's, you know, it's something that everyone has a different idea about. And that's probably what is great about that question, is that it can be answered in so many different ways. And the book doesn't set out to answer that question. It simply aims to present all of the great ideas, the great work between art and fashion, and you know, we chat with a lot of curators and artists and designers throughout the book, which, you know, so there's a proliferation of great ideas in there, and we really just wanted it to serve as as an inspiration to people and to really catalogue this great moment in fashion.
And how did you get your start as a fashion journalist?
Well, not in fashion, really. I was a cadet journalist at a community newspaper, and then slowly moved across to the styles desk, as it was called. So working across design, fashion, and sort of general popular culture. And I was there and then became the editor of that section before moving to GQ, where I was an editor. And then leaving there a few years ago to work in a freelance capacity while I was working on books and museum shows. So it's sort of been not a typical trajectory, I guess, but I've wound up here in the end. And I always had an interest in fashion. Journalism was, you know, what I wanted to do, and it just so happened that I've ended up writing about something that I really like as well.
Well, it seems like the trajectory for a lot of journalists isn't what it once was. I mean, there's been a lot of, you know, cuts and there aren't those sort of long held positions anymore. So it seems like increasingly, and it's the same in the work that I do, where freelance is the option. What do you like about that style of working?
Well, I think it's what's driving the industry now. But what I always find is that, you know, when I was working full time in publishing, is that you get so caught up in the day-to-day running of a magazine, and you're in meetings and you're talking on the phone and you're working with the advertising departments and circulation and marketing, and there's less and less of actually being a journalist. There is so little time that you're at your desk writing. Being freelance, you can sort of work on so many different things, and I'm lucky to be able to write for so many different magazines, and so I can write about, you know, some great buildings that are being created by architects for Architectural Digest or Vogue Living, but then I can write about a fashion show like Future Beauty for a magazine like Vogue or Manuscript. So we get to cover all these great things, and I find so much, you know, as the book demonstrated, that these worlds feed into one another. So I think it's so important to be able to cover all those worlds in the same breath, because, you know, you go into this exhibition and you can see the way that fashion is inspired by architecture. So, you know, to have a knowledge of architecture is so important. And, you know, or to go to the Gaultier show in Melbourne, and you can see the great influence that he has had on music and vice versa. And so to be able to write about music as well, I'm not writing really about one topic. I'm not writing about garments so much as a cultural movement.
And what was the process in terms of transitioning from having the position at GQ to going freelance to actually deciding you want to start your own magazine, Manuscript?
Well, in hindsight, probably a rather daft one to go out and start a magazine when every other magazine is shutting down. But I felt like there was this gap in the market to create something new and to be a new voice for the industry, and particularly for menswear, where there aren't that many magazines, but there's been this great interest in menswear, particularly in Australia in the past few years. It's interesting to see for online stores like Mr. Porter or Matches that Australia is the second biggest market in the world, and you know, that's not per capita, that's actual sales. So it's evident that men in Australia are interested in fashion and they're buying it, but there are so few magazines documenting it. So that's what I wanted manuscript to do. And of course, over the past 3 years, it's evolved a lot, and we cover arts a lot and really document the crossover between music and fashion and art and design, and try to reflect that. And it's important to me to be able to cover a lot of Australian events and Australian designers and creative talent here, because I think we sort of overlook that for international names a lot, and that's a shame, because there are people in Australia that are doing great things, and it's nice to have a platform to document and to celebrate that.
And you talked a little bit there about the rise in interest in men's fashion. What do you think is driving that? Because I've observed a similar thing.
I think it's over the past 10 years, we've had such great access to it, online with the internet, and websites like the Sartorialist have a way of documenting fashion that feels accessible, and it sort of engages people to be interested in it in this way that they never were before. And then with the launch of all the online stores a few years ago, it's given us in Australia this access that we never had to fashion. I mean, there aren't that many fashion stores in Australia that are selling, the labels that perhaps we want to get our hands on. But now we can buy anything. So we're really being able to perhaps buy the things that we might have always wanted to, but never had the access to. Before you might have travelled overseas or something like that. But now if you're interested in something, you can purchase it straight away. So I think it's not so much a newfound interest so much as one that's just being met by the market now.
So you don't think that there's been a sort of a cultural shift around men's appearance and
Certainly,
fashionability?
but I think that goes across all industries. I mean, that's Australia is far better off economically than it was in decades prior, and we're sort of interested in a more not so much a luxury lifestyle, but I guess a design-led lifestyle, and you can see it with the food movement. That we're so interested in, in organic food, or the great dining experience of going out. I think, and the rise of European cars in Australia. So I think we're sort of just engaging with design and lifestyle, more and more, and I think that's sort of it ties in with this growth in menswear.
And who do you read? Who do you think is a good fashion writer?
Well, it changes all the time, because everyone's moving around so quickly. But constant sources of information are, I guess, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal for the real business side of fashion, which is what I'm really interested in more than the cyclical sort of seasonal trend reporting. I think whenever I go to a dinner that's celebrating a designer, I'm always more interested in sitting next to the CEO or the managing director than the designer, because they can tell you so much about the business of fashion, and it's such a big industry. It's in terms of numbers, it's incredible. Globally, and that goes from the luxury end, with the couture, right down to the high street, and feeds into a whole another discussion. But it is a great business, and it's so interesting to be able to report on that in a way that we might report on the car industry or the food industry or any other.
We still seem very wedded to the idea of the creative genius in fashion, though. Like, everybody seems to want to know the narrative of the designer as though that's some kind of mythical, mysterious process, and less about all of those things that you're talking about.
It's slowly changing, though. I think we had the sort of the hero designer in the 90s, or the 80s, 90s, and even in the early 2000s, where it was all about the creative genius. It was about their personality more than the clothes that were offered. But with the fall of certain designers for different reasons, I think fashion houses have become very conscious of that, and of putting so much pressure on a singular designer. And so now I think there's a lot more focus on the design team as a whole. There's a lot more focus on the house, and talking about the house's values and what's integral to the house in terms of its archive and its history. And the artistic director is important, obviously, but it's not sort of so singular. And I think there's been so much split up as well now that the one designer isn't now just taking care of they're not designing the men's and the women's and the couture and the accessories. And within a house there might be 5 or 6 creative creative directors or artistic directors, and we can look at each of them and they sort of share what this empire that maybe one designer was responsible for in the past.
That's interesting though, because for instance in art fashion in the 21st century, things like art fashion designer collaborations, it's all about the artist and the designer. It's not at all about that kind of mundane business stuff.
No, not at all. And but it's interesting to see how in that context an artist will come in and reimagine the house's iconic pieces. And I think it was most interesting with Louis Vuitton because it's so careful with its copyright and its creative image. Around the world there are always court cases about infringement and the knockoffs at markets of that fated monogram. And particularly through the 2000s, it was such a popular piece of material that it was so surprising then to see an artist like Takashi Murakami or Richard Prince go in and graffiti over the top of the monogram, or to do something totally crazy to that. And in a way, it shows that a house like Vuitton can thwart its own status. While sort of reasserting itself as the original tastemaker. And, of course, then those bags that were recreated were knocked off and sort of created a whole new chain of events.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. I want to talk a little bit too about, when you launched Manuscript and for quite a long period of time, it was a print-only magazine. And fairly recently you've gone into the online space with it. What prompted you to do that? Because I guess it's a slightly different way of going about it. It seems like a lot of things are starting as online and then becoming print. But also, what are the different constraints in the print versus the online environment for Manuscript?
It's very hard to migrate from one to the other, and I think that is where a lot of people sort of fall over in a way. And we've seen traditional magazines create websites and they haven't worked so well, and then we've seen incredibly successful blogs become print books, which is interesting as well. But for us, it took so long. It took 2 years to get the print up to the standard that I was happy with, and to really develop that and create an identity for it, that we didn't want to sort of overtake the print manuscript with something digital. But then the time came to do something online, because with a quarterly print magazine, it's hard to be. We can report on fashion in a timeless way and do these sort of great feature stories, and people can keep it for months or years and spend time reading it. But to be relevant in a way where we can cover things that are happening now, we can't do that in a print magazine. Even a monthly or a weekly, it's hard to keep up. But with online, you can cover it as it happens, and that's the great thing about the internet. So, on our website now we do 4 stories per day, and 2 on weekend days, and that allows us to keep up with everything that's happening, because it's such a fast-moving industry that it's a shame not to report on things as they happen, and I guess that was the impetus. In terms of how they're different or similar, I think they share the same tone of voice. I think it's still manuscript, and we still report on fashion in a way that's intelligent and considered, but still accessible and entertaining. It's just the speed at which it's published is different, and I think people go to the website for a different experience than picking up the print magazine. I think that's something that you keep on your coffee table and you keep to read, whereas online you might click through for a few minutes while you're at your desk, and you can buy something, if you click through a link or anything like that. So it's much more, they're very different experiences, and I'm very conscious of that when we're planning the content for both platforms.
Do you think that the online publishing environment for fashion is increasingly geared towards that click and buy kind of mentality as another gateway into getting a consumer?
Yeah, absolutely. It's that path to purchase thing that people talk about. It's something that advertisers want to be part of, but it sort of adds another layer to it. I think with a magazine, the greatest sort of impediment to the success of a print magazine is that you see things on a page, but then how do you find it? How do you buy it? Where do you look for it? Can you try it on? Is it even available in Australia? Whereas with online, we can, you can see the image and you can click on the image and be taken straight to the checkout with that garment. And that's the great thing about it. And it's incredibly satisfying and also incredibly expensive once once your credit card's keyed in there. But it's what the internet delivers, and I think that's what people want from the internet, is that instant gratification.
But do they also want quality content?
Absolutely, and I think that's where brands like Mr. Porter and Net-a-Porter have been so successful, is that around an online store, so essentially a department store on the internet, they have built an amazing editorial brand, and I think you'd agree that going on those websites, their online presence and particularly the editorial aspect of it is far greater than a lot of traditional print magazines that have built websites. But at the end of the day, the stories that they're creating are to lead to a sale, and it's an incredibly smart way to build a business. I think people are seeing through traditional marketing, so building that editorial experience where they feel like they're learning something, they're being entertained, and they're taking something away, which is the garment that they might be buying. That's what am I trying to say? That's how an online store can rival the experience of going into a physical bricks and mortar department store, where you have the great experience of being in a beautiful store. Online, you have the experience of reading great content and seeing beautiful shoots and being inspired to buy the product.
But do you think the consumer understands the delineation between marketing and content?
I think it's an intentionally blurry line, but I don't think that's something that is exclusive to online. I mean, you have to think that fashion magazines do have a commercial imperative, and so even though there's not that instant click through to a sale, everything that's in a commercial fashion magazine, is essentially driven by advertising relationships and those kinds of things. So I think people sort of always hang that on digital experiences, but it is something that it goes across to print as well.
And you mentioned Net-a-Porter, and there's been a few others that have, been primarily online and have built a really incredible identity online and have now started publishing magazines of their own. Why do you think that? I mean, to me, that means that obviously there's some cachet in the printed material.
Absolutely.
What is that about?
I think people attach a certain quality to print. We think of, especially as sort of print is dwindling in the mainstream sense, a beautifully designed hardcover book for a coffee table, or a really great sort of hard to find magazine, something like that is an experience that's not equated by an online click. And I think that's why brands like Net-a-Porter or a blog like The Sartorialist or Men in This Town or The Man Repeller are publishing books or magazines, because there's this inherent quality to the printed product, and people like to have something to hold. I mean, it's great to have a website that has 4 million subscribers, but it's hard to measure that in your mind, whereas when you see the printed product, or you can come into greater contact with an audience in a real way, not sort of virtual, it's very satisfying. And I think it also adds cachet to the online product as well. To say that Net-a-Porter has a printed magazine, or that the Sartorialist has a printed book, it's a different thing to saying I have a blog, when you can say I have a blog, but I'm a published author as well. I think we hold some sort of esteem around that idea.
And you recently sort of invested in more art content in manuscript. You've done an art issue, and increasingly art has been filling the pages. Do you think that that's something that will continue, and why? I mean, there's plenty of art publications and plenty of fashion publications. Why? What is the benefit of bringing them together into manuscript?
I mean, it's my personal interest as well. I think there's that, and because it is my own magazine, I have the it's a great opportunity to explore the things I like, but they're so intertwined, and again, we cover a lot of exhibitions in Australia. It just so happens that this season that every major exhibition in the country is about fashion, So in covering arts, we're covering fashion, and in covering fashion, we might be talking about a collaboration with an artist. Like in the current issue, there's the great the piece about Ruby Sterling and Raf Simons, and there's the story about the fashion exhibition. So these worlds are so intertwined that it's impossible to try and separate them anymore, or to just write about one of those worlds, or to even try and put them in different sections of the magazine. It doesn't work because there's so much crossover, and I think it's more a reflection of what's happening than any sort of conscious decision to say, oh, we're going to start covering art now, or starting to introduce music.
And what have been the precedents for you in that in other published formats that you've kind of not necessarily modelled manuscript on, but have been inspired by or felt kind of driven by?
Well, we try and be different. I think that's what has been our point of difference, is that we sort of don't try to look at anyone else. But in Australia, there is some great commercial magazines, but there hadn't been any sort of really great independent magazines. But I'm sort of interested in those magazines that do fuse everything from business to lifestyle to commerce. So something like Monocle or Wallpaper, who have done it very well and built a brand around that extends to books and newspapers and radio stations. I think that's really clever, to go completely cross-platform. Locally, I think there are brands that are doing it really well as well, like Broadsheet, who, again, started a website with the printed product and have been able to develop them both together as separate entities, but sharing a similar voice.
And what's the future direction for manuscript from here?
Just to keep honouring what we've done and keep it increasing. I mean, there's no great plan to try and sell 100,000 copies. We're happy selling the 20,000 copies that we sell now. We're increasing a lot overseas, particularly over the past year. We've really grown in Europe, in London specifically, and we have a great audience in the US as well, and it's really picking up in Asia. And what's exciting about that is that we can showcase Australian talent to a much broader audience. We try and shoot as many Australian designers or Australian artists and creative talent across all spheres as much as possible. And to now be able to share that with a global audience is exciting, because people want to know about Australia. They know that there's exciting things happening here, or they've seen Australians working in companies overseas. So I think if we can share that with a bigger audience, we can bring more attention to the people doing great things here, and that's what I'm really excited about.
And you, before you did art fashion in the 21st century, you actually did a book about Australian and New Zealand fashion designers, and it was really, I suppose, a series of profiles of emerging and established designers. Was that the reason behind doing that as well, this desire to actually get the word out?
It's sort of a record in time. There were 70 designers in that book, and it was an unprecedented moment in Australian fashion. Throughout the 2000s, we saw all of these great brands come about, especially, sort of around 2000, we had Subi and Tony Matichevsky and Willow and Sass and Bide, and there was real excitement, and that's sort of what's, got me thinking about it and led to the writing of that book, was to document it, because the only book prior that was sort of 20 years beforehand, and that was a great reflection. I thought that was a great record of that amazing period in the 70s and 80s when Australian fashion was really exciting. And it's interesting to see now, sort of 5 years later, the way that Australian fashion has changed going through that book. You can sort of tell it was published in 2010. There are so many names that have sort of faded away or that have been bought out, some that you sort of have forgotten. A lot of them are still very present. And to think if you were to do it now, 5 years later, there would be so many new names as well, because the industry is just growing. I mean, we were looking at this research the other day. There are 17,000 people studying a fashion-related course in Australia right now. And that's not just fashion design, but it sort of extends to costume design or styling or fashion photography. But 17,000 is an incredible number, so it's only sort of suggestive that the industry is going to continue to grow. And
is it though? I mean, is it a false sense of growth? I mean, I think often, I did my PhD in fashion curatorial study when that kind of area was just starting to take off, and I can now see that there's other students coming behind me wanting to do a similar thing, but I don't know that there's necessarily the jobs to support them.
No, but there's initiatives like the Australian Fashion Chamber that are bringing the industry together to really create a platform for growth. I think up until now, the Australian government hasn't been that involved in fashion. I guess they've not really realised the economic power of fashion, but that's changing, of course, with exhibitions like this. And so there is, I think we'll start to see a lot more investment. But so many Australians are going overseas as well, and that's both good and bad. It's a loss, but it's still great because they're representing Australia, and those people often come back as well with great experience. So we're exporting these great people to fashion companies all over the world, and not just as designers, but in other areas like marketing or publicity or photography. So it's I think it's an exciting development, and we'll see what happens, I guess, in that area.
And is that something that you hope to document more in manuscript, is sort of the more diverse range of practices within fashion where Australians have actually, I guess, infiltrated the global industry?
Yeah, I mean, we try to work with always Australian talent. So everyone that works on our shoots, even those overseas that we do in Paris or New York, we try and work with Australian photographers that are based there. Just because I think we have such a unique take on things in Australia, and that's something that we've developed over time. It's just sort of our cultural tendencies. But what people always say when they get manuscript is that, they can sort of see an Australian sense of humour in the fashion shoots, or the landscapes that we can shoot in Australia, and we try to maintain that here and overseas, so that it's not just Australian fashion that we're representing, but it's put together by Australian people as well. So it really has a unique voice in the global market.
And do you think that the remit has really expanded beyond focusing on men's fashion as well for you?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's always just been sort of part of what we do. I think that's what people hang the magazine on, but art and architecture and design and music, they've all been incredibly important and will continue to be a really big part of the magazine. So.
And where do you see fashion publishing, both online and print, heading in the next 5 to 10 years?
It's an exciting time, I think. I think what's really exciting is custom publishing. So what people like Net-a-Porter are doing, and Mr. Porter as well, that's a great time. We're in a really exciting period for custom content. So, and you can see it in Australia as well, that brands like Maya or David Jones are really investing in creating content.
What do you mean by custom content?
Well, creating their own magazines, creating their own blogs. I think that's where sort of things are headed. But more broadly, I think we'll just see a greater separation and meeting of digital and print publishing. There was always the saying that print was dying and digital would take over. I don't think that's the case. There's room for both, and we're really starting to see how they can work together and how they can be different voices in the market and offer people different things. So it's an exciting time, I think. I think there is a lot of change in the market at the moment, but we're sort of heading into this place that's new and uncharted, and that's always the best time for exciting developments and for new opportunities.
And what's the next book for you?
There's a few. Alice and I are really interested in the way that music and fashion look at each other. I mean, we saw that great explosion of art and fashion with all the collaborations, which are now sort of, I think, slowing down. But obviously fashion exhibitions are still incredibly huge. But music and fashion they're always the worlds that have always looked at one another. I think musicians have always embraced fashion as a way to, create their persona, and fashion designers have always looked to different musical icons or musical genres, to create their collections. But what we're seeing now is these sort of hybrid museum exhibitions about music and fashion, like the David Bowie exhibition that's coming to Melbourne next year, and that fuses his unique take on fashion and art and music. Also, fashion houses are creating these incredible foundations that are supporting music projects like the Burberry Acoustic Project, which provides a platform for emerging British musicians. I think that's an incredibly exciting area, and a lot of houses are really investing in that. So we're interested to see, where this takes us. We're only sort of just beginning. But
and would it be, again, sort of a focus on quite a recent slice of time
so.
rather than a historical overview?
It won't be so historical. I mean, obviously, it's impossible to talk about the present without the past, but we really want to focus on the projects that are happening now, to create a sort of snapshot of where the world is at this moment. And I think that's what these books will serve to do.
And in terms of the manuscript team, how many are you guys at the moment?
Continually growing.
Just wait for that to stop.
We're growing. It's nice to have a mix of people, and we have writers and photographers working with us all over the world now, which is creating sort of new voices. When that first year when we started, I had to write every story because I couldn't afford to pay any
I
other writers.
remember looking at the first issue and seeing the author line for every story by Mitchell Oakley Smith.
But
by
now,
Mitchell Oakley Smith.
there can be issues now where I don't write anything because I have all these other writers contributing, which is great because it opens up to so many new voices.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I think at this point we might actually pass over to questions. So we've got Sophie here with a microphone. So if you want to just pop your hand up and wait for the mic to come to you, and then we can go from there. If we have any questions.
We should have Dorothy Dixon one. Well, we'll be here anyhow after.
Yeah, we've got one in the front.
Given how popular the internet is becoming, do you think that the modern culture is going to mean that style will be changing more quickly all the time? And how do you think that's going to affect people's opportunities to buy things to keep up with style?
Sorry, what was the first part?
Given how the popularity of the internet nowadays.
Do you think it would be hard for people to keep up, do you mean? Well, I think that's the allure of the internet, is that it's so fast moving, and there's the sense that you have to, I find myself doing it all the time. I'm, constantly refreshing a Twitter feed or an Instagram feed because I want to keep up. I feel like I'm going to miss something, and online as well. The daily drops on those fashion websites. There's something there and it's gone the next day. And there's been sort of an incredible shift lately. I've been seeing so many of those brands like Mr. Porter introducing capsule collections that are exclusive, and they publicize them and they're there for 24 hours, and you have to buy now because you get caught up in it.
It's exhausting.
The flip side to that is that we've seen this sort of slow culture emerge, and I think it's across all. Actually, it's sort of across all areas. We saw it with slow food movement that was a reaction to fast food, and then I think we're seeing it with print publishing becoming really popular again because people are so inundated with the speed of online content that to pick up a book or a great magazine is sort of a rewarding experience to be able to switch off. So I think there's sort of two worlds that will just sort of continue to grow counter to one another, but I don't think the internet's slowing down.
It's a good question. Any other questions? Yep.
This will just have to be the last one because we're almost completely out of time.
Hi. I'm just wondering how you feel consumerism and sort of fast consumer moving goods, how that's affecting creativity in fashion.
It's interesting. I think it has two roles to play. It's great in a sense that a brand like Topshop or ASOS is engaging, for example, young British designers to create capsule collections because they're designers that don't have stockists, and they're starting out, so they don't have many, they don't have the funds to do much, and sometimes that can stifle them creatively. But to have a platform where they can create a collection for Topshop and get a paycheck, and it can be seen by a broader audience, which can bring attention to them, that's really great. But at the same time, you see designers being ripped off by those same retailers. I know it happens with friends of mine as well, where they'll create something and it's seen on the runway, and before they can get their collections out, it's already in store. And you could say, it's a form of flattery, but at the same time, they have to make money. So I don't know how. There's no laws against it. There's only so much you can do with copyright, and often small designers can't even, take that. Can't even go into battle with the big company. I don't know that it stifles creativity so much as deprives them of sales and growth, and that's a shame. But that's where it's the role of the fashion initiatives to support those designers, and the British Fashion Council and the CFDA in America have done a great job of really creating a platform for young designers, and so many of them over the past 10 years have become big brands now. I think brands like Christopher Kane that were starting out 10 years ago are now empires. And I think with the Australian Fashion Chamber launching this year, we will hopefully start to see that in years to come as well. I mean, and it has happened with a few Australian labels, but I think in 10 years we might start to see the next big names now becoming truly global businesses.